Prophets, by definition, are those who speak God's word to deaf ears and hard hearts. It's no wonder, therefore, that even though each of the biblical prophets has a unique message addressed across many decades, they consistently speak God's word of judgment and his impending action along with God's promise.
Why the consistency regardless of the specific circumstance? Because they are addressing God's people who have gone astray, and the prophets are being sent to deliver God's word of judgment, action, and promise.
In discussing Creatio ex Nihilo in relation to the prophets, it's first important to notice that the prophets are speaking God's word, not their own. And therefore, they're not just pointing out societal ills and community problems. The words they speak come from God, who creates by his word.
That means that the prophet's words are not simply God complaining about his people, but they are God creating a new reality. This new reality is God promising that creation will not be separated from its creator. In other words, God will not allow his creation or his people to become its own creator and thus to exist according to its own word.
Let's start with Isaiah. Isaiah begins by speaking, "Hear, O heavens, and listen, O earth, for the Lord has spoken." And for the next 4 chapters, we hear God's accusations, making his case against Israel. It's a lawsuit, pointing out the harm the people of Israel have caused by ignoring or not hearing God's word.
The orphan and the widow have been neglected. Wars among nations and fighting among families have caused destruction and desolation. Justice and righteousness are scarce. So what does God do? Let's keep walking through Isaiah to find out.
This next chapter, Isaiah chapter 5, is God's well-known love song for his beloved. Quote, "My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it, and he hewed out a wine vat in it. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes." End quote.
And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? The point is clear. God has provided all that his people needed and more. You can even hear the pain of God's heart for his people, asking, "What more could I have done for my vineyard?"
And yet, God goes beyond lament in verse 5 and following. "And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and it shall be overgrown with briars and thorns. I will command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it."
Luther calls this the height of God's wrath, in which God is promising the destruction of creation by removing his word in order to show the futility of living without God as creator. In this way, God makes clear that humans are not able to thwart the creative work of God.
As Regent Prenter notes, quote, "Not even the most sinful and disobedient person, not even the devil himself, the prince of evil spirits, can bring God's work to naught," end quote. Why not? Because only God can do that. God alone, by his word, can bring his creation to nothing.
Throughout the prophets, you can see God working in the same fashion. For example, Micah 6:8 is famous for telling you what the Lord requires: do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. What is not so well known is that these requirements are not something sinners are actually able to do.
In other words, what the Lord requires in Micah is in direct opposition to what sinful humans want to bring about before God. Bowing before God, burning sacrifices, offering your wealth, or even your firstborn child. None of these offerings will please God. Rather, the requirements Micah speaks of are the very things that you ought to do, but will not do.
Put simply, in delivering these words through Micah, God is not giving us a path to follow to meet the Lord's requirements and then hoping his creatures will do better. Instead, Micah's words function to deliver God's judgment that convicts sinners.
Let's look at this a little more closely. When people believe that they are something other than a creature of God, and they believe they have made something of themselves on their own, pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, then God's creating word is experienced as wrath. It is a word of judgment and an attack on the very things they love about themselves.
On the other hand, God's creative word is new life and pure mercy to all who despair in themselves. For this, we can look to the valley of dry bones in Ezekiel 37. There, God speaks to his people in the aftermath of the total devastation brought about by the Babylonian exile, the very devastation God caused.
The prophet Ezekiel is given a vision of a valley full of a multitude of very dry bones. There is no hope in this image. The message is clear. Everyone dies. Yet, in the midst of the hopelessness, God commands Ezekiel to prophesy, to preach to the bones. O bones, hear the word of the Lord.
Now, speaking to bones is about the best way possible to see that it is God's word creating out of nothing. The vision of bones coming together, covered with new living flesh, and receiving the breath of life from God, is exactly what God says he is doing to the whole house of Israel. Dried up, cut off, and hopeless, God is sending Ezekiel to preach God's word of new life. From the nothingness that Israel is at that moment, God's word creates them anew.
Creatio ex nihilo means creating out of nothing. Thus, in order to create, God first destroys and brings to nothing, just as happened with the prophets. Paul Althaus puts it this way, quote, "For Luther, creatio ex nihilo is more than an assertion about the origin of the world. It is an all-inclusive characteristic of God's creating and working. As such, it manifests itself also in the way in which God works men's salvation. In this, too, God creates everything out of nothing. He takes the man who was nothing before him and clothes him with the worth of a righteous man. God makes what he makes under the veil or form of its opposite, and therefore also out of its opposite. He creates life under the form of death, yes, by the way of death. When he intends to exalt a man, he first humbles him. When he intends to give his gifts to us, he first of all destroys us and what we have and thereby creates room for his gift." End quote.
This is what Luther calls God's alien work, which he takes from Isaiah 28:21. It is an alien or foreigner's work, simply because the sinful creation has sidelined God and become estranged. God has to work as an outsider, fighting to save his own creation.
Or, as Luther writes, because you scoff at the word, the Lord is forced to do a strange work, namely, to judge and to destroy. For the proper work and nature of God is to save. But when our flesh is so evil that it cannot be saved by God's proper work, it is necessary for it to be saved by his alien work.
God the Creator, as we've seen in the prophets, does this alien work by which he condemns the ungodly in order to create them anew as his creatures. Listen again to Luther. Quote, "God must act by means of an alien work."
For if he wants to sow the seed, he must get rid of the weeds and clear the way for God's proper work. He condemns and expels people's own righteousness in order to give them his own righteousness. He kills the flesh in order to make the spirit alive.